Amen. Okay, good morning everybody, and welcome to another fellowship. We're going to continue where I left off last time. I was partway through the topic early 2520 controversies, and that's in the broader picture of my study on the 2520, the 7 times of Leviticus 26. So when we met last weekend, I had listed 6 points that Hiram Edson had made in his articles, which were published in 1856, and we got through the first 2. So we're going to continue with point 3 to 6, I hope. I think we'll get through them. So point 1 that he made was an argument that Miller's version of the 2520 was wrong. Shouldn't start at 677 BC, it should have been started at 723 BC, and that would take you to 1798, and he gave a few reasons for that. The second point that he made is about, he gave a story about how Daniel was taught, basically Daniel was taught the 2520 by Gabriel, and he follows through the verses in Daniel's chapter 8, 9, 10, 11 and 12 and goes through a sequence and shows how the order was done and how in the end Daniel understood but had to keep that a secret. So he was allowed to know how long, in fact, the indignation would last for. So going on from point 3. All right. Point 3, Hiram Edson's point here is that the 1798 is the second Exodus. So he's using basically reform lines. He's comparing ancient Israel with modern Israel, and he's paralleling the 2 histories and the Bible verses concerned. So he's got ancient Israel, the Exodus, and modern Israel, 1798. So Daniel 7 verse 22, 21 and 22, if you want to turn to that you can, I'll read it out. So Daniel chapter 7 verses 21 and 22. I beheld, and the same horn made war with the saints and prevailed against them until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was given to the saints of the Most High, and the time came that the saints possessed the kingdom. Okay, Hiram Edson picks up on the phrase, until the Ancient of Days came. He's going to say God came down in 1798. Okay, why does he say God came down? He said it's not the second advent. The words come down here can be compared to Exodus chapter 3 verse 8. Exodus 3 verse 8, if you're turning to it. Okay, speaking of the Exodus. And I came down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land unto a good land and a large, unto a land flowing with milk and honey, unto the place of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites. So he compares the phrase coming down in Daniel 7:22 and Exodus 3 verse 8, and you see in both cases God came down. Okay, so we see that parallel there. We've got also Isaiah 11:11, which I mentioned last study as well. And he's applying this verse to 1798. And it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people. And the verse continues. So he's applying that to 1798, and it's talking about the second time the Lord set his hand. And then further, if you just skip down a few verses to verse 16, it gives you the first time. Verse 16, so Isaiah 11:16. And there shall be an highway for the remnant of his people, which shall be left from Assyria, like as it was to Israel in the day that he came up out of the land of Egypt. So the second time is 1798. It's like the first time, which was out of the land of Egypt. So this is the case of God setting his hand. So first time and second time. All right, another verse, Daniel 7:26. Okay, we also see this, this phrase being used, but the judgment shall sit, and they shall take away his dominion to consume and to destroy it unto the end. And we also see back here in 7:22, we've also got judgment. Hiram Edson is applying this verse here, Daniel 7:26 to 1798. What's the judgment? He's going to explain if we compare it to Genesis 15, verses 13 to 14. Okay, it's not judgment of the saints, it's judgment of the captor. So Genesis 15, verses 13 and 14. And he said unto Abram, know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterward shall they come out with great substance. So we see judgment is occurring upon Egypt here in the Exodus, and judgment is occurring upon the captor, the persecutor of God's people. So he's comparing those two and paralleling them. Okay, another interesting parallel he makes is that there's a population increase just before the Exodus. So we see in the ancient Israel, as the Exodus was coming near, they were coming closer to the time of Exodus, the Israelites multiplied in number. And he says the same thing happened with modern Israel. As 1798 approached, we had the Reformation under Luther, and there was a great increase of people. So I'll just pop that there as well. Okay. In the case of the Exodus, we see the end of the kingdom. We see the Egyptian army killed at the crossing of the Red Sea, and we also see the papacies killed at the end of in 1798. one other really interesting parallel that he makes, looking again at Genesis chapter 15, verse 13 and 14, I think it's 13, it speaks of the 400 years. And Parminder doesn't just think that 7 times is 7 years, he also thinks it's 7 multiples, 7 times in terms of a multiplication. So it's 7 times longer than the first captivity. So the first captivity in Exodus is 400 years, and the 2520 is obviously 2,520 years. It's not exactly 7 times, but it's near enough for Edson. And he says the 2520 is basically 7 times as long as the first captivity, which was in Egypt. Okay, so that's basically how he lines up the 2 histories and makes a parallel, compares the 2, and he's making his case that 1798 is just like a huge exodus, just like a repeat of history. So they're the reasons he gives for that. Moving on now to point 4. Yeah. Okay, so we'll post these pictures up afterwards. Okay, I've given this the heading, The Passing of the Purple. So we'll just talk about the papacy first. We have the woman on the beast with pearls, precious stones and gold, dressed in purple and scarlet. So we're going to talk about her first, what the pearls and the precious stones and the gold represent. Okay, so Edson just goes through to say that these symbols in the case of the papacy are symbolic representations of her characteristics, but also literal things that also she had. So she had literal crown with literal stones on there. There was a literal cup and all of that. So these things represent her characteristics, but they were also literal things. He's going to say the literal cup that was held by Pope was a symbol of the golden censer, which meant that he was claiming to be a high priest. Okay, so a high priest counterfeit. The literal stones was interesting. He says that quite possibly that these stones arranged on the crown or the tiara were arranged with a secret code, possibly. There was a rumour that the Jews who hated the Catholics and did the jewellery encoded in there in a certain hieroglyph fashion, had written the words "Mystery Babylon the Great" on the forehead, that he would wear it unknowingly or unwittingly. And he said that, that was possible, just that it was literal as well as a characteristic. So that was interesting. Now these things were taken away by Napoleon in 1798. And we've got Revelation chapter 17, verse 16. which says, "And the 10 horns which thou sawest upon the beast, these shall hate the whore, and shall make her desolate and naked, and shall eat her flesh and burn her with fire." So he applies this to the papacy. Okay, so I've just popped there the notes that were just mentioned, and but he applies this just to the papacy. But the purple and the scarlet he's going to apply to the kings as well. So the other kingdoms come before and after the papacy. All right, so using various means, going through some historical events and also through Bible verses, he'll use line upon line basically to prove that the purple and the scarlet represent civil power and royalty. He's going to make the point that purple and scarlet were real colours worn at that time by papacy as well, and others, but they also represented those things too. These two were taken away from the papacy in 1798 when she was made naked. And interestingly, in 1799, so the year later, the next year, Napoleon put on scarlet clothing, and he was asked, do you really think that's suitable? And he said, oh yes, fine, it's good for me. So he put scarlet on, and that's a symbol of him taking on the power. So these things were literal, but I also symbolised the real power play going on. And Napoleon also in 1799 said the phrase, "We, the inheritors of Caesar's power." So he makes a claim that he's taken the power on. He's basically taken the purple from the papacy. So we're talking about the passing of the purple is the exchange of power or supremacy between different entities at that time. All right. So in terms of passing the purple, Edson then lays out some of the history surrounding the papacy and this passing of purple that was going on. He's going to make the point that in 1798, Napoleon takes the purple away from the papacy and applies it to himself. So he's taking the power, the supremacy of Europe to himself. And before the papacy, we had Clovis. So he has Clovis and then the papacy and then Napoleon. Clovis comes to the papacy, gives her the purple. Napoleon comes to the papacy and takes away the purple. He's going to list all these chiasms here. He doesn't label them as chiasms, but he lists them all really neatly, and it just strikes you how these chiasms are at play. So there's 95% Edson here and 5% me. I'm going to call them chiasms and draw them up, and they're quite interesting and profound. Okay, so you can see there that in 1798, when Napoleon took the power from the papacy, this creates a chiasm because we have France coming to the papacy, giving her power, and France coming to the papacy and taking that power away. Next, we have the next passing of the purple that Edson applies is 1815 Waterloo, the loss of Napoleon at Waterloo and return of power that goes to the papal kings. What he says there is that the papal kings willingly permitted Napoleon to do this work against the papacy. So they gave their power to Napoleon. Napoleon removed the papal kings and the Allied powers. Napoleon removed the papal kings and then he went through and placed kings of his own choosing there. And then after Napoleon had lost at Waterloo, the Allied powers then gathered together, took away the kings that Napoleon had placed and replaced them with papal kings. So there's power exchange again. We have another chiasm because we have papal kings involved here. So in some ways, it just seems like the power is just going backwards and forwards between the two parties. All right, the next step in the process, we have 1848 and the European revolutions, and this is another passing of the purple according to Edson. We had the result of the European revolutions in 1848 resulted in Napoleon's dynasty being brought back. That being Napoleon III was put back onto the throne. So we have another chiasm here. Okay, so we have Napoleon first and second, then we've got papal kings, and then we've got Napoleon III. So Napoleon, papal kings, and Napoleon. We have another chiasm, and if that's not enough chiasms, we can put it all together and make a big one. We'll end up with France, papacy, France, papacy, France. So 5 in a row. France, papacy, France, papacy, or papal kings, and they give the Pope a bit of power and land and everything, and France again. So I'll pop that there and we'll take a picture and then go on. Okay, I'm going to clean that up and then we'll talk about why that's relevant. Okay, so that's the process we've got drawn up that Edson brings out. Now we're going to talk about the scarlet beast. So we've got Revelation chapter 17, verse 3. So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-coloured beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. Okay, so we've seen that verse, the beast there, the 7 heads, the 10 horns, and the woman. Okay, so going with that, how do we know who Napoleon is? Napoleon's dynasty was a head of the scarlet beast. It has to be one of the heads, according to Edson. Okay. Why does Napoleon's France have to be one of the heads of the beast? First of all, it took the purple, which means it had universal supremacy. It took it away from the papacy. It took it to itself. It has to be one of the heads. Also, yeah, it stripped the papacy of her purple. And we see in Revelation 17, verse 16, the verse here and the one that we read before, that they made her desolate and naked, and they ate her flesh and burnt her with fire. This verse is quite interesting because it makes another chiasm. And Edson describes this chiasm without calling it a chiasm, but that's what he's basically describing. So I'll just draw that up as well. Okay. So he's going to say that the eating of her flesh here is a repayment for her drinking the blood of the martyrs. So she drank the blood of the martyrs. The kings ate her flesh. There's a chiasm there. We've got papacy and papacy here. And we've got martyrs and kings there. And the reason that I'm saying that they're equivalent, we've got martyrs here suffering from the papacy. Their blood was drank. The kings ate her flesh. They did that on behalf of the martyrs that were gone. That work of revenge was executed by the kings here. So basically working as one unit here, these two parties, and we've got the papacy there and there. So it's like a mirror. We have a return, justice is served. I'll read this verse here from Revelation 6, 9 to 10, these verses. So Revelation 6, 9 to 10. Okay, and when he had opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of them that were slain for the word of God and for the testimony which they held. And they cried with a loud voice, saying, How long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not judge and avenge our blood on them that dwell on the earth? And Edson is saying that this judgment and vengeance was poured out in 1798. We'll have one more point here as well. Another reason Napoleon is the head. The 10 horns gave him power. That means that he was supreme. They gave him their power, or they willingly permitted him to do the work that he did. Of course, he turns around and takes those kings out and replaces them with his own. So we've got Revelation 17:17. Okay, so I'll just read that verse out. For God hath put in their hearts to fulfill his will, their hearts being the kings, and to agree and to give their kingdom unto the beast until the words of God shall be fulfilled. So that's Edson's case for arguing that Napoleon is one of the heads of the beast. We've taken a picture, so I'll clean part of that up. Okay, now, death and resurrection. Okay, so we're now starting to talk about Napoleon. We'll start with him. Why Edson believes that Napoleon is in fact the seventh head, so the last head, and that's because he's going to pick up on Revelation chapter 17, verse 8. Okay, so Revelation 17, verse 8 says, The beast that thou sawest was and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition. And they that dwell on the earth shall wonder, whose names were not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold the beast that was and is not and yet is. Okay, so Edson says that this verse applies to Napoleon as the head of the beast. Napoleon was alive here. It died here, was in the bottomless pit, and comes out of the bottomless pit and goes into perdition. So there's a death and resurrection of the beast there, the beast being Napoleon, having the head of it. Right. So just drawing it as an illustration, Napoleon's alive, dead during this period, and again alive. Dying in 1815 at Waterloo, rising again at the European revolutions, and then being alive at the end for a short space and going into perdition. So we have a death and a resurrection, and he's using this to prove that it's the seventh head and then the eighth, and we'll get into that again in a minute. Now, papacy's death and resurrection is a separate thing. So he has both doing a death and resurrection. So let's look at that. Revelation chapter 13, verse 3. And I saw one of his heads, as it were, wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast. Okay. And again in verse 12, 13, verse 12, and he exerciseth all the power of the first beast before him, and causeth the earth and them which dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. So we talk about the one that deadly wound was healed. Now he's applying these verses to the papacy. Okay, so you can see there that there's two separate deaths and resurrections going on, so as not to get confused. And they occur in sort of in each other's place. They swap roles backwards and forwards. Another point that he makes there is that the life here, he stays alive. His life is prolonged. He's given limited power. So the papal kings that gave a bit of power and land back to the papacy during this period just gave him a little bit, just enough to keep him going until the judgment at the end. So he picks up on Daniel chapter 7, verse 12. And I'll read that. As concerning the rest of the beasts, they had their dominion taken away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season at a time. So he's applying that here, saying the papacy's life was prolonged at this point. His life was prolonged there. Okay, now I'm just going to put a little asterisk there as well, because this papacy little part here, he's not given full dominion or full power, just portion. So that's to understand that to be partial. Okay, so just partial there. Okay.
Okay. Katherine, can I just ask a question?
Yes.
Yeah, Napoleon now is another head. And
Yeah, we're going to talk about the heads. We'll talk about the heads now. Ask me that question after the next bit.
Okay.
And see if I haven't answered it. Yep.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. So just a little illustration there to help put them all together. The death and resurrection of the papacy, the death and resurrection of Napoleon's dynasty. He's calling Napoleon the seventh head, which is the eighth. And he's going to call the papacy, the one preceding Napoleon, is going to be the sixth head. He's not going to give another head to the papacy because it doesn't get its full power back. It's just given partial power here, just enough to keep it alive. So that's why he's not calling the papacy the 8th head there. So we've got here Revelation chapter 17, verse 11, which says, "And the beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, and is of the 7, and goeth into perdition." So Edson is expecting Napoleon's dynasty to continue until the second advent. As far as I can tell, that's what he's thinking, that will be there, just kept going until they're dealt with. So just put that verse there. Okay, that verse just having to do with the 8th head. So working backwards, the papacy has to be the 6th head because that's where the power transferred from. So he's going to put this verse here, Revelation 17, verse 10. "And there are 7 kings, 5 are fallen, and 1 is, and the other is not yet come. And when he cometh, he must continue a short space." This the 8th head is going to continue a short space, this return of Napoleon's dynasty. Whereas you can't apply a short space to the papacy because it was there for 1,260 years. So nobody could call that head. The one that's the short space can't be the papacy is the point. So the papacy has to be the 6th. And then we're going to keep working backwards from there. We'll just take a picture of this. Okay, so he's given reasons why Napoleon's dynasty had to be a head at all. Now he's just said why it has to be the 7th going into the 8th. And now we've worked backwards. He said the papacy had to be the 6th because that comes before the 7th. And that particular head is the one that had the wound that was healed. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the 10 horns. Okay, so we see Bible verses saying that the 10 horns, they gave their power to the beast. So they've taken their power away from the papacy and they've transferred their power to Napoleon in 1798 when he did his work. So we see the 10 horns at play here. It's got Revelation chapter 17, verse 17 again. Which God hath put it in their hearts to fulfill his will and to agree and give their kingdom unto the beast until the words of God shall be fulfilled. This is applying that verse here to the 10 horns. Then he's going to say that the 10 horns came into history before the papacy. So we know they're here for this head, and we know that the 10 horns are in existence at the 7th head, and now we can see that they come even before the papacy. We've got Daniel chapter 7, verse 7. And he's going to apply that there. "After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible and strong exceedingly, and it had great iron teeth. It devoured and brake in pieces, and stamped the residue with the feet of it. And it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns." And then the next verse in chapter 7, verse 8 of Daniel. "I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn, before whom there were 3 of the horns plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things." So you can see in this verse that there were 10 horns. 3 of them were plucked up and another one replaced it. So the 10 horns were before the papacy arose. I'll put those references up as well. Okay, so he's going to argue now that the 5th head was while the 10 horns were in existence. And he's going to say that it's barbarian Rome. So he's got Clovis here. We know we've got Clovis here already. So the 10 horns were there. They had the power. Then the power then transferred to the papacy from them. This is his argument, and that's why he's saying that barbarian Rome was the 5th head. He's going to group Odoacer and Clovis together. What else do I have to say about that? And another reason that you can prove, or he's proving, that this barbarian part of Rome held the supremacy is because they were able to restore paganism to Rome after Constantine. So the fact that they did that was proof that they had a lot of power. So that's why he's calling them a head. So I'll put that there as the 5th head. Okay, and now we're just working back again. One step before there, we've got Imperial Rome was the 4th head, and that's the red dragon of Revelation 12. Imperial Rome, the red dragon. Of Revelation 12. And then going back from there, we have, then it's easy, Babylon, Medo, Persia and Greece is the 1, 2 and 3. So what can we learn about the woman who sits on this beast? And what can we learn about the horns? He's going to say the horns were really only on these last 3 heads. So if you're going to draw a picture, you'd put it sort of like, okay, only on those 3. About the woman is sitting on the beast. She's not just sitting on the 6th head, she's sitting on the whole beast. She's been in existence for this whole time. So the woman can't be just the papacy or the papal church. The woman has to be the church that covered all these time periods. I'll just draw that quickly. Okay, so the woman is the world's church in all of its forms, is his point as well. And now we also have the mention of a mountain, the 7 heads, or the 7 mountains upon which the woman sits. He's going to compare the 7 heads with the 7 mountains, and he's going to put those 7 mountains into one great mountain. Let's just look at Jeremiah chapter 51, verse 25. And this verse says, "Behold, I am against thee, O destroying mountain, saith the Lord, which destroyest all the earth, and I will stretch out mine hand upon thee, and roll thee down from the rocks, and will make thee a burnt mountain." Okay, so Edson here is saying that the great mountain is composed of the 7 mountains on which the woman sits, and it all combines to make one big persecutor over the history of this period. So draw that. The woman sits upon 7 mountains, visualised this way, a sequence of kingdoms, but really all one big mountain. The basically Gentile powers that are going to be overthrown at 1798. So if you can visualise it that way, that's what he's trying to describe there. Then God will punish this great mountain because of its destruction that it's been doing over the earth. So the church then represents pagan churches as well as papal churches. And obviously he's going to say that the papal churches are paganism dressed up in Christianity anyway. So there is paganism there all the way through. Okay, so I'll just stop there. Did anybody have a question now at that point before we move on to the next one? If you could put it, unmute yourself and ask. I can't see the chat. So if you can, rather than putting it in the chat, if you can just voice it, would be good. All right, that's fine. Go on.
Sister Katherine.
Yeah.
For those that have joined late, could you just clarify that you're reading through Hiram Edson's articles?
That's right, yeah. So if anybody's just joined, this is a history lesson. This isn't current teaching for this time, our dispensation. This is a history lesson on what Edson taught about the 2520 articles written in 1856, 7 articles. And I'm just going through the history. I've done part of it last Sabbath, and this is the second half. So yeah, if you can just understand while I'm speaking that this is a way that he viewed it, even a way that maybe it could have been applied in that time period if the second Advent was earlier than today. This may have been an accurate way of understanding the heads and everything. So yeah, not to be confused with how we might apply those things today. Thanks. Okay. Okay, I just want more space on the board. So I've cleared off the topics off the side. We're on the last point anyway. Now, what's the point of Edson? He's talking about the 25-20, so why does he bother to go to all this trouble to talk about who all the heads are and all of that? And the point that is this, that he's going to point out that we are in a time of gathering now. I'll draw where the 25-20 sits in relation to these 7 heads as well, so you can see how he visualises that. It's not that the 25-20 ends after the 7th head. Okay, this is how you would picture it. We've got 7 heads, but the 25-20 goes until the end of the 6th head, and then we have a period of release. So like a year of release. Okay, 1798 marks the beginning of the 7th head and the beginning of the release. It's the last phase before the 2nd Advent. 7 means complete. So he's saying that once this Napoleon era is over, that's it. Because 7 means complete, being perfect. Napoleon here, in this case, is like Cyrus. There's a deliverance here going on, and he's allowed to continue a short space until all that work is done, especially when it was the 7th head. So 1798 until 1815. That was a short space for that work to be completed. So his main point, and this is the climax of all his articles, is that we're in a gathering time now. As in he's speaking in his day, they're in a gathering time. So he's going to talk about the gathering of God's people, and again we're going to see him comparing ancient and modern Israel again. Okay, I've drawn the 2 hands there. That means when God set his hand the first time, when God set his hand the second time. Edson goes on quite a fair bit about that verse and applies it over and over again there. The Exodus and 1798 being the Alpha and the Omega histories there. But not only that, he also sees 2 gatherings at each of the, so he sees 2 gatherings going on at the Alpha and 2 gatherings going on at the Omega. So I'll draw that on there as well. All right, as you can see there, he's identifying that when ancient Israel was delivered from Egypt, they were gathered into the wilderness, and then later they were gathered into Canaan. We have, I'll actually write underneath the steps that they took. So we can see there that ancient Israel were in Egypt, they crossed the Red Sea, they were gathered in the wilderness, and then they were gathered into Canaan. Then he goes to apply that to his own day. He's not saying that this year of release they went straight into Canaan. There's two gatherings, so it's a two-step process. First, they go into the United States, and then they're going to go into their eternal inheritance. So this period of release, it's going to span that time period. I'll just write up there. So we've got the USA and we've got the eternal inheritance paralleling the wilderness and Canaan. Okay, so Egypt, then when you apply it to that day, the Gentile kingdoms, those 6 heads there. The Red Sea crossing is applied in his day to the Atlantic Ocean. They did a crossing across the sea to the United States. So both were in fact literal crossings of seas, of literal oceans. All right, and now he's going to spend some time in his documents arguing that the United States is the 2-horned beasts. So I'll draw his reasonings why he's going to say that and prove that although the scarlet beast is still alive, the 2-horned beast has to be the United States. I might not actually draw it, I'll just describe it. So the scarlet beast is still alive. I will draw it. Look. Okay, so here we've got Egypt, and here we've got the wilderness, and here we've got the Red Sea and people crossing. So that's the parallel there. And now we've got the beast over here. The scarlet beast is over here. No, I won't bother drawing all the heads on. Do you know what I mean? It's alive here. It's still in existence, and it's supreme over this part of the world. Okay, and when it says in Revelation chapter 13, verse 12, about the 2-horned beast, the 2-horned beast exercises all the power of the first beast before him and causes the earth and them which dwell therein to worship the first beast whose deadly wound was healed. The point here he's saying is that if this other beast, the 2-horned beast, exercises all the power of the first beast, this one, why isn't it, if it was over here, it would really be just another head on this beast. It wouldn't be a separate beast. It has all the power, it has the supremacy, but this one is still in existence, but they're not the same beast, they're 2 separate ones. So the only way you can explain that is by saying it's in another territory, it's somewhere else. And therefore he's arguing that has to be in the United States because there's other reasons. They're crossing west, and there's other reasons we'll have a quick look at in a minute. So there's one beast in Europe and Middle East, and then there's one beast in the United States. And they're not sharing power, they're both supreme in their own domain. Okay, we'll just take a shot of that. Right. Okay. Okay, so this is, be nice if I did it a bit neater, but anyway, it's supposed to be parallel. We've got the ancient and the modern Israel. We've got this version of spiritual Egypt, the Gentile kingdoms, heads 1 to 7, or 7 mountains. We have a crossing of the sea. This is literal ocean. This is the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, and then this is symbolic crossing of the Jordan into our eternal inheritance. The wilderness then is the United States. Paralleling the wilderness. So whereas Edson and his cohort in this time period, they're right here, they're sitting right here in this time period. An interesting application he also makes is that the stone that is cut out, that's the stone that God's people were cut out of this mountain. So that's the way Edson applies that, which I thought was interesting. So this remnant comes out, it crosses, it comes and lands here in the United States. Now the comparisons between the two. So we have captivity here and captivity here. This 2520 was occurred after the pride of their power were taken away, Israel's pride of their power. So if we look at Leviticus 26 verse 19, the verse was, I will break the pride of your power and I will make your heaven as iron and your earth as brass. Edson talks about the fact that this began when the king was removed from power back in 723 BC. So he applies that it's taken away here and then the pride of power is restored here. And that restoration is in the form of the United States government. It's a restoration of their power. He says that so back here when Israel was free, their government was actually Republican. And he says that this is also Republican. And the reason he's saying Republican for ancient Israel is because he's using proof texting on the terms vine and fig tree to prove that in ancient Israel they actually had a republican government. So it was here before the mountain, you know, before this desolation happened, and then the republican government is given back to them. They have restoration here of that power. And he also says that the Puritans who came to America first, they had wanted to reinstitute the Jewish system of government, that's what they said openly that they wanted to do. So that was their intention, to restore that type of government. Now, this time period is really important because he's calling it a test of loyalty. We see a test of loyalty here. This can represent Sinai, and they're given a covenant and law here, and then they're tested to see if they're loyal. In the same way, when God's people come to the United States, they also are tested to see if they are loyal before they can enter the eternal inheritance. So where Edson and his people and the people of God are is in this test of loyalty. So that's really important. I'm just going to read Deuteronomy 8:2. Okay, Deuteronomy 8:2. And thou shalt remember all the way which the Lord thy God led thee these 40 years in the wilderness, to humble thee and to prove thee and to know what was in thine heart, whether thou wouldst keep his commandments or no. Okay, so here God is saying, he's talking about it later, but he's saying, remember when you were here, I was humbling you, I was proving you, I wanted to know what was in your heart, I wanted to know whether you would keep my commandments or not. So he's applying that here, the same thing. Okay. Now there's a list of prophecies, of prophetic fulfillments that he sees in the United States as a country. I won't list them all, but certainly if you look up the original document, you'll find all the references and there's quite a long list. But yeah, he says this is the wilderness. This is where you see the vine and fig tree restored, the Republican government. This is a time of preparation. He brings up steam trains. He applies some verses that seem to indicate steam trains, that those steam trains are occurring during the time of preparation. So that's like a proof for that argument. Okay, he's talking about the West. So when my other illustration, God's people head west out of Europe and the Middle East, there are verses that talk about people heading west during the time of restoration. So he's applying that there as well to the United States. This is the pleasant land. This is the glorious land. This is the glorious holy mountain. He talks about, there are also references to across the sea and on ships in certain prophetic passages that he applies here as well. Obviously, they came on ships. And then the ensign and the trumpet. So I'll draw them up there. The ensign and the trumpet, they're calling God's people, they're calling them from the Gentile kingdoms into the United States. So he's placing them there. I'll read a couple of verses there. We've got Isaiah chapter 11, verse 12. And he shall set up an ensign for the nations and shall assemble the outcasts of Israel and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. Okay, so that's the ensign, they're calling people from the four corners of the earth. And in Isaiah 18, verse 3 and 7. Can you get rid of that? Okay. Okay, so that's that one. And the second one there is, all ye inhabitants of the world and dwellers on the earth, see ye when he lifteth up an ensign on the mountains. And when he bloweth the trumpet, hear ye. And then going to verse 7. In that time shall the present be brought unto the Lord of hosts of a people scattered and peeled, and from a people terrible from their beginning hitherto. There's a terrible people here. A nation meted out and trodden underfoot, whose land the rivers have spoiled, to the place of the name of the Lord of hosts, the Mount Zion. So these are being the concluding remarks of his articles. It says to be continued, but he doesn't continue the series. If we think about where they were on the, I'll just pop this up. That's supposed to be an exclamation mark. Okay, that's Edson talking. He's in 1856. He's here. He's telling them they're in their test of loyalty. They're in the time of preparation. God is testing and proving them to see whether they love his commandments or not. This is what he's saying, and this is when he's saying it. So just puts it into context that that's what he's doing. We have here two charts as well. They're the two charts that they've got, and they're being tested on their loyalty at this point in time. All right, so Miller, if we can remember Miller, we had William Miller from our earlier presentations. He had his version of the 2520, which was from 677 BC to 1843. And he had come at that through the sabbatical year, through Nebuchadnezzar's parable, through the two 1260s that he developed as well and understood. He had seen two 2520s but focused on one, and he was looking at Leviticus 26 the 7 times and applying it to that time period. So we had Miller over here. And then we had Edson over here. Okay, and like Miller, Edson's got many reasons to argue for this. He's got the beginning of captivity, he's being 723. So he's got arguments about the history of Manasseh and the history of what was going on with Northern Kingdom of Israel and Assyria. So that's one argument. He's got that this is a second Exodus. He's using that parallel. He's got the arguments about the passing of the purple and the interchange going on there, which supports his view of the scarlet beast and all the heads of that. This is all used to develop the idea that they're in a preparatory gathering. They're in the wilderness time period, so they've been gathered in the first step of gathering, but they haven't yet come to the second step of gathering, which is in the eternal inheritance. So he's got all of these arguments. He's also got Leviticus 26 7 times, which is applying here. So you've got both of them coming up with quite good arguments for both. The charts have got 2520 still on them at this time. This is what's going on around the time period between 1856 and 1863. So we can see here, from this point here all the way through to here, we've got this kind of argument or debate or disagreements going on about which view of the 2520 should be correct. So they're viewing it as either or, a bit like how we talked about at the start with the two models of intensity and duration. It's an either or situation. And what happens in the end is that they say no to both. No to those charts because they've got the 2520 on them. Okay, and then they make a new chart. And this is what happens in 1863 when these charts are developed. So by the time they get to here, 2520 is just rejected outright altogether, and the arguments are basically the ones that would be used to support the intensity model. I will read out a short, like I've just sort of paraphrased some of what James White had written about the 2520. So just to make it simpler, I've got a bit of it I'll read verbatim, but some of it I'll just skip through, just so you know what James White had written. The articles were published in January of 1864. So the following year, when this was basically, 2520 was just put aside and shelved, put away, put in the rubbish bin. Okay, just reading from this, I'll put the reference up. Okay, so that's the reference, and these are my closing remarks, so we're going okay. Or not quite my closing remarks, nearly. All right, so this is what James White had written in his article. It has been supposed that the expression 7 times in verses 18, 21, 24, 28 of Leviticus 26 denoted a prophetic period of 25-20 years, and that this period covered the time during which the throne of Israel should be and remain subverted and trodden down by oppressing powers. To rightly fix the commencement and termination of this period became therefore a matter of consequence. Where does it commence and where does it end? Okay. Have been questions of much study and perhaps some perplexity. These are not the questions, however, that we propose here to discuss, for there is a question lying back of these which demands to be answered first. Namely, is there any prophetic period brought to view at all in Leviticus 26? We claim that there is not, and will offer a few of what are, to us, very conclusive reasons for this position. Now I'm just paraphrasing. Remember, there are 5 threatenings of judgment, an initial one followed by 4. So he's talking about that there are, if you recall that chapter itself, there's 5 different threatenings of judgment. The last 4 mention 7 times, but the first one doesn't mention 7 times. Why didn't God mention 7 times in the first threatening judgment? Why are the judgments listed different from one another in each description of 7 times? Why are the judgments getting progressively more severe every time they're described? Why does God place an if statement before every description, making it conditional? Why is the last step featuring characteristics that preceded the downfall of Jerusalem? The answer to these questions is that it should be interpreted as severity. The Hebrew supports this view. 1, the word is actually an adverb. 2, the word times isn't even there, making it different to Daniel 4 and other time prophecies. Even the Greek supports this view. 1, the word used is also an adverb, and 2, the word used is different to Daniel 4 and other time prophecies in the Greek as well. So then there is no prophetic period in Leviticus 26, and those who imagine that such a thing exists and are puzzling themselves over the adjustment of its several dates are simply beating the air. To ignore or treat with neglect a prophetic period where one is plainly given is censurable in the extreme. It is an equally futile, though not so heinous a course, to endeavour to create one where none exists. So I hope that that's clear. So that's where we end off in 1864, and we will hopefully address more of that later. We also know that in the book Daniel and Revelation by Uriah Smith, he also discusses this 2520 issue with the similar types of arguments. All right, so now this is my concluding remarks. We can see here, God's plan for his people was for them to go into the wilderness, straight through and straight into Canaan. He did not plan for them to wander around for 40 years. Likewise, what do we see here? We see that God had planned for God's people, for his people to enter straight into the eternal inheritance. He didn't want them to hang around and wander around the wilderness for another however many years it ends up being. So we see there another parallel. Modern Israel repeated the history of ancient Israel despite themselves, and too many of them failed the test of loyalty, and God has had to wait for another generation to come. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for your blessings. We thank you for prophecy and the way that it helps us to understand more clearly. We have to apply many of these things differently in our time, some of them the same, and please help us to distinguish those things which need to be adjusted so that we can understand more clearly. We apologise for sins that we and our forefathers have committed, and we ask you to help us and to accept our offerings of ourselves as we try to be faithful and to be obedient to you now in this time. Pray a special blessing upon all the people who are present with us in this meeting, this virtual meeting, and also others who are meeting elsewhere. We pray that you would to teach us and to just give us that special blessing that we get on Sabbath. In Jesus' name, amen.